I want you to turn with me this morning, as you probably already guessed, to those verses at the end of Matthew 11, the verses numbered 28 to 30, which they read as follows: "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy, and my burden is light." Down the years, we find that many people have turned to those verses and have been challenged and blessed through them. Many tell us about what those verses mean to them, and we read in some of the literature about that. Bishop Ryle, who is a writer whom I have an enormous respect for. If you ever read anything by Bishop Ryle, read it. One page of Bishop Ryle is worth 100 pages, and many others. But he comments on these verses. He said, "They are verses which deserve to be read with special attention for 1800 years. That gives it away, doesn't it? That's when he was writing. 1800 years, that 1800s he was writing. And yet he writes as if he was writing yesterday. That's the amazing thing about it. Anyway, we would say for 2,000 years, those verses have been a blessing to the world and have done good to myriads of souls. There is not a sentence in them which does not contain a mine of thought." We find many writers using the message of these verses in relation to their own lives or in connection with the lives of others. One writer who is worth noting is Mrs. Beecher Stowe, and it's in that wonderful book, Uncle Tom's Cabin. And in it, she tells at one point about 3 slaves sitting together at the end of a long and exhausting day. 2 of them are women. The third is Uncle Tom. Seeing that the women were tired, Tom grinds their corn for them. And they in turn make Tom's cake or bread for him. And they sit round the fire at the close of the day, and then Tom brings out a book. "What's that?" "Read a piece anyways." Tom says, "Come unto me, all ye that labour and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." "Them's good enough words," said the woman. "Who says them?" Well, beginning with those good words, Tom tells the 2 women the story of Jesus. Who says them? I suppose that's the great question. Well, you and I know exactly who says them. And we know that through Jesus and through him alone, there is the possibility of a saving relationship with our Father in heaven. And he alone is the one who can invite us to come to him, and from him we receive the kind of rest that we need. I want to look at the verses under 3 headings. Preachers often do that, don't they? 3. First of all, the burden that is borne. The burden that is borne. Secondly, the invitation that is issued. And finally, the rest that is received. Firstly, then, the burden that is borne. "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened." Picture is, of course, that of those animals that we speak about as beasts of burden, horses or donkeys. or even cattle in some places. Such animals are used, as we know, in the ploughing of fields, or drawing heavy carts, or maybe just having a burden on their back. Well, Jesus is, of course, speaking here about the burden of sin. And he is really addressing people who are conscious of that burden. Everyone is a sinner, there's not much doubt about that. We all sin. But not everyone is conscious of the fact that they are a sinner, and they do not feel a burden at all. I read those earlier verses in Matthew 11, where Jesus denounces the cities in which most of his miracles had been performed. And he says that the people of Chorazin and Bethsaida and Capernaum, that was the place where Jesus spent most of his time, Capernaum. He said they ought to have understood the message and the miracles that he performed. And they should have repented long ago. But they haven't. And he even says that if the people in Tyre and Sidon, those were the Gentile towns away up to the north of Palestine, if they had witnessed the kind of miracles that had been seen further south, they would have repented long ago in sackcloth and ashes. He says even the city of Sodom would have been spared if the people had had the kind of advantages that those people during Jesus' time had. And because of the privileged position that some people enjoyed and did not respond, they would be judged more harshly on the day of judgment. Among later Christian writings, the book that will come most readily to mind is The Pilgrim's Progress. The kind of book that was in everybody's home a long time ago. And you know, I have to admit, I'm reading through it at the moment for the first time in my life. I read bits and pieces of modern versions and here and there. I'm reading the whole of it for the first time. Terrible. Anyway, it's interesting. The image that stands out in The Pilgrim's Progress begins with a great burden on the back of Christian. The dreamer says, I saw a man with a great burden on his back. And the bearer of that burden himself complains, I am in myself undone by reason of a burden that lies hard upon me. Later, when he talked to evangelists, Christian said, I fear that this burden that is upon my back will sink me lower than the grave. That was how this man who had set out on his journey felt. But not many other people felt it. Not even Christian's wife and their 4 sons. All who had been brought up in the same environment with the same advantages. They felt at that time no burden at all. It's right, of course, to remember that the second half of the book is about the journey of Christiana, Christian's wife, and the 4 sons. They made their journey later. But at that first stage, neither family members, and certainly not any neighbours, felt the way that Christian did. 1 or 2 of them followed a short distance and then turned back. But mostly, everybody thought, this man has lost his marbles. He should be put in a place for safety, or at very least given some medical attention. They didn't feel the burden at all. One who comments on the Pilgrim's Progress called Robert Stevenson said about the burden. He said, not the fact, but the sense of sin constitutes this load. And the sense of sin is a long step beyond the fact of sin. Not only that, but it is a step towards the light. It means eyes open to the truth, a conscience alive to God, a mind quickened by the message of the book, a heart impressed by life's reality. The man with the burden on his back is the most clear-sighted man in the city of destruction. His neighbors are free from the load resting upon him, not because they are braver or better, but because they are blinder than he. Well, we all need that consciousness of sin. There's not much dispute about our sinnership. Common with the rest of humanity, we have sinned all right. But are we aware of the reality of that position and what it means or doesn't mean for our relationship with God and our eternal destiny? We should see it as a positive step, a good development, when the law of God and the Spirit of God makes the fact of our lostness known to us. It's good when, like the psalmist says in Psalm 38 verse 4, my guilt has overwhelmed me like a burden too heavy to bear. It's right. It's good to experience the sense of sin as a burden that we want terribly to get rid of. Burden that is borne. Secondly, the invitation that is issued. Jesus says, come to me, all you who are weary and burdened. These burdened people were weary of it all, and no surprise. Those who were heavy laden labor with the problem. They long to be rid of the burden. And maybe it's not a bad idea for us to cast our minds back just to what the circumstances were around the time when Jesus was on earth. People generally suffered from all of the difficulties common to all humanity. They were members of a fallen race, fallen themselves. In their ordinary day-to-day lives, there were many pressures. Sometimes their hardships were severe. Normal life was seldom easy and straightforward. There were some moments better than others, some were worse, and some were very bad. So they suffered generally from the times in which they lived. But add to that, the people hearing this invitation were a religious people. They did desire to have an answer to their problem. They knew about a problem in their lives, and they did what they could, as it were, to deal with it. They were prepared to try to help themselves. They'd make use of the local synagogue, and they would make the journey to Jerusalem maybe at least once a year, if not the 3 times. They were aware of the need to be right with God, and at least in a general way, and they did what they could and used all of those things that were in place at the time. When you think of what was in place at the time, I think we get an insight into it at a later time. You remember that time at Antioch when Gentiles became believers? And then, of course, there was a visitation from some Jewish leaders who weren't entirely happy with how things were going. And they said, oh, all you Gentiles, in effect, you need to become Jews. You need to be circumcised. You need to do all the things that were set down in the Old Testament. And it led to a big synod in Jerusalem. And at that synod, Peter argued strongly against these Judaizers. He said, "Now then, why do you try to test God by putting on the necks of the disciples a yoke, that neither we nor our fathers have been able to bear?" He looked back to what they and all before them had to put up with before the coming of Christ. And then here were people who wanted to continue that. And Peter has plenty to say to them. A day needed to come when the new covenant was in place, and it had. All the hardships associated with the old order were about to pass away and needed to. So you had the normal trials of the time, and you had the drudgery of the Old Testament system, and there was something else. And that was the unhelpfulness of the religious leaders of the day. The law given through Moses was relatively straightforward, but the Jews had added to that law over the years. They had interpreted the commandments in such a way as to place an intolerable burden, and we hear references to it in the New Testament from time to time. Pharisees and teachers of the law calculated that the 10 commandments were not 10 at all. How many were they? 613 no less. 248 positive, 365 negative. Not surprising that there was more negative than positive, but 613 is just too much. No wonder that at one point Jesus said, "And you experts in the law, woe to you, because you load people down with burdens they can hardly carry. And to add insult to injury, you yourselves will not lift one finger to help." Terrible. So we can see that the people to whom Jesus was speaking needed to hear that message. "Come to me, all you who are wearied and burdened." Because of the general circumstances of the time, because of the demands of the Old Testament system, and because of all the additional burdens made by the scribes and Pharisees, people truly did feel burdened and weary. And they were ready, at least some of them, were ready to hear the invitation from Jesus. But let's quickly come 2,000 years on. What's the position in our time? Well, the 21st century AD is a different time. And it's better, let's admit it, in many ways, at least in the Western world. Advances in medical science have meant the alleviation of much suffering. Many illnesses that could not be cured long ago can be cured today. And even where illnesses cannot be cured, there are ways of making sure that people do not suffer pain terribly. Diseases are cured. Economic developments too have led to a better standard of living in the world generally. On the religious front, the burdens associated with the Old Testament sacrifices and all of that are long since gone. Hopefully we have no modern scribes and Pharisees or religious leaders. I hope not. All of that we can say is positive and good. We welcome improvements in general life and in the religious landscape. But we have to ask ourselves, what have we made of the privileges, speaking generally? Because people generally are much easier, I think the picture is that people think they do not need God. They do not feel their need. Life is good. We're self-sufficient. And because of the lack of fear of God, people, without a thought, ignore God's law. They shamelessly flout his guidance in every area of life and think not enough. And those in authority enact laws that are clearly an affront to the teachings of the Bible. People and nations go on without a thought. So in one word, instead of modern people being grateful, they're simply godless. And what that adds up to is that people do not feel a burden. They're not heavy laden. They're not laboring. They have no strong sense of sin. In the Pilgrim's Progress, Christian met people like that along the way. There was those three men in the grassy place, more or less asleep, and Christian talked to them, but no, they weren't interested. They were fine. They went back to sleep. And then there were a couple of strangers who came tumbling over the wall. They didn't want to bother coming in at the beginning of the journey. They saw no reason to come in at the opening gate, and they would come in their own way, and they were on the way to the celestial city just like everybody else. They were fine. They needed no invitation to do anything other than they were doing. Don't bother us. And very soon, of course, they went out of the way. You know the story. The burden that is borne, the invitation that is issued, received or not received, finally, the rest that is received. There are many people in our world, vast majority, I'm afraid, who do not have this consciousness of sin about which we're speaking. They're not burdened, they're not weary. But there are people who are. Those were the people who were being addressed by Jesus, and those are the people who are addressed today by the Spirit of God. They are well aware of their need of rest, and that is exactly what Jesus offers. Come to me, he says, and I will give you rest. And unless we miss it, first time he repeats it, you will find rest for your souls. What can we say about this promised rest? I think it could be spoken about in different ways, but I want briefly to talk about it in three ways: peace, progress, participation. First of all, peace. Coming to Christ means that load being lifted away. Christian in the Pilgrim's Progress enjoyed great peace when his burden fell off his back. Peace is one of those blessings that comes with the work of the Spirit, love, joy, and peace. Those who come through faith have peace with God, peace within themselves, and at least a relative peace with other people. How often we find ourselves going back to Augustine. Thou hast made us for thyself, and our hearts are restless until they find their rest in thee. My friend Bishop Bryan comments, there is rest in Christ, rest of conscience and rest of heart, rest built on pardon of all sin, rest flowing from peace with God. Life isn't always easy, let's admit it. Life isn't always entirely happy. There will be times when things are good, times when things are anything but good. But in the midst of the worst things in life, there can be, and there are for the Christian, a deep satisfaction through every eventuality that comes our way. The Puritan Richard Baxter said near the end of his life, I have pain, there is no arguing against sense, but I have peace, I have peace. Come to me, and I will give you rest. Come to me, and you will find rest for your souls. Peace. Second thing I want to talk about regarding this latter part is progress. Notice that Jesus adds, take my yoke upon you and learn from me. Coming to Christ is not the end. You know, I hate it when people say I got saved. And that's it. I like to see something in their present life that indicates that they got saved. Coming to Christ is certainly not the end. It's the beginning of a wonderful journey. We did learn, of course, important things. In order to begin that journey, we learned about our sin, we learned about God, and we learned about Christ. Those were very vital things. But there are many new things still to be discovered, many new things to be learned. There are various channels, aren't there, through which we can learn and make progress in the Christian life. The Bible becomes a new book. A long life will not be enough to explore it all. We learn through meeting and worshipping like we are doing today, and there are many good books, older books and newer books that are there to help us grow in the Christian life. The point that is particularly made is that we learn from Jesus. Learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, for I am meek and lowly in heart. Meekness is yet another of those virtues alongside peace in the fruit of the Spirit. We learn that Moses was one who was very meek. The Amplified Bible, which I always find helpful, says that meekness of Moses was mild, patient, long-suffering. And if Moses was like that, Jesus is so much more. Qualities of gentleness and humility were seen so fully in his life as ministry. So we have a perfect example. We have a sympathetic teacher from whom we can learn as we seek to progress in the Christian life. We can be helped in many ways, but our greatest help is in our relationship with Christ. One last thing: peace, progress, participation. Referring to the yoke for the second time, Jesus says, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light. The rest we receive means peace, means progress, but it also means participating in things in the world, participating in service. It's an active rest. Some of you will remember the Shorter Catechism question where Christians are warned about the danger of the Sabbath rest being profaned by idleness. The rest of the Sabbath wasn't to be idle, and nothing is to be idle in the Christian life. After all, think about a yoke. When you have a yoke, there's a burden going on. There's work going on. A yoke can have to do with a single person. I checked the dictionary, it said a frame fitted to a person's shoulders for carrying a couple of buckets. Well, I didn't have that kind of frame when we carried the couple of buckets from the well when we were young, but apparently such a thing exists. But far more often, a yoke is associated with the work of animals, usually two animals linked together, drawing a plough or a heavy cart. Important, we're told, isn't it, that the animals are the same in type and in size and not unequally yoked, with its own reference in another direction, hasn't it? It's important that the harness is well made in order that the work is tolerable. And Jesus tells us that the yoke that he provides is easy, and so the burden is light. We participate with Jesus and with his people, and serving others and seeking to make the world a better place. And Jesus never puts a burden on us that is impossible to bear. Samuel Rutherford said concerning Christ's cross, he said, it's the sweetest burden that ever I bore, It is such a burden as wings are to a bird, or sails to a ship, to carry me forward to my harbour. We can be happy with the burden that Jesus asks us to bear in the work of his kingdom. It will be something, anything we do, we will find fulfillment even in the doing of it itself. I'm closing with a story. We read that in a minister's study in the south of England, there hung a picture. It was a picture of a ship about to sink, and one person was being rescued from it. The story behind the picture was that a certain man had come to that church to arrange a burial place for himself when he would die. And the minister showed him round the graveyard, and eventually they decided on a spot where he would be buried when he died. And then the minister took the opportunity of saying to him, "Now that you've found a resting place for your body, tell me, have you yet found a resting place for your soul?" The man was quiet for a moment. He said, "You're the first person who ever asked me that question." And the man went out and on to seek and to find that resting place for his soul. And as a token of his gratitude to the minister, he sent him this picture of the sinking ship from which one man was being rescued, and he felt that he was that man who was being rescued. You know, some of us know about resting places for our bodies, but wouldn't it be the strangest and the oddest and the most tragic of things to happen in life, that we would go to trouble to arrange where our grave was, and not to have made our peace with God and find our rest in him. The burden that is borne, that sense of sin, that awareness of sin, the invitation that Jesus issues to people to come to him, receive that rest. And that rest is a rest that can mean peace. It can also mean an exciting life, progress, participation with other people. Amen. Well, our closing psalm, closing praise is Psalm 37, and the verses numbered 3 to 6. Psalm 37, 3 to 6. And the tune is 73. 37.